good to be with you. Happy Sabbath. It is January 11th, and it is gorgeous outside. And it's kids' church. So if you're not frequently here with us on Sabbath mornings in this room, you wouldn't know that many weeks, like especially over here, this is kind of I think of this as being the Perry. I'm trying to think of the other, this is like the Perry section, right? And they're all over at kids' church once a month during the school year. We have a special program that's for kids. And so this space kind of thins out at 11, but this is my first time being over here with you during my new leadership here at the church. We've only been here, I think we talked about it, we just entered into the 7th month of the Loewen stint here at Redlands Church, and it's been a beautiful thing. But this is my first time being here on this side. During Kids Church Week, I've been over with my boys on the last couple of times, but I wanted to spend this morning with you here. So here we are. We have been working through a sermon series we just began about loss, and talking about grief, the process we go through to heal loss. And we have this picture, this famous Banksy stencil graffiti artwork, and our wonderful creative team has helped us out with a balloon here to kind of, remind us and signify something we've lost, what we've gone through. Last week, just as kind of a recap, we argued, or I made the argument that loss is universal. Everyone goes through loss as a part of their lives. And I made the argument that even though there are lots of different theories for how we process loss, there are different models, and many of them have been helpful to us at different times, it's a pretty unique process, and we wouldn't want to overlay that on everyone and say, well, you have to do it this way, you have to go through that way, or else you're not doing it right, or whatever. No, the models can be helpful and useful for helping us to make sense of and explain what we're going through and what we're in the middle of. But man, the process of loss is messy and complicated. Oops, that's the wrong slide. Well, I thought I had the one that I wanted, but I don't, so we're not going to show it to you. But so we talked about how loss, how going through grief is not linear, it's not automatic, it's not something that's shared by any of, but yet grief is absolutely essential. And there's all sorts of problems that can crop up if we try to sidestep it or avoid it. And if you were here last week, you might recall that we closed by talking about the first and maybe the most essential step of working through grief is to name that thing that was lost, to just admit it, to own it, to talk about it, to name it, to speak it, to share it with someone else, or just to be able to pray about it. So we ended with an exercise where we named our grief to God privately between us and God. So, this is why I had this picture. I remember now. So, if you happen to miss a week, if you missed last week, for example, you can catch all of the recorded sermons. We have a podcast. It's called Behind the Sermon, and you can get it on iTunes and Stitcher Radio and iHeartRadio, and we're on Spotify and the Google Play Store. Anywhere where you get podcasts, you can get this podcast, Behind the Sermon, or you could just go to behindthesermon.com, which is connected to my personal website, and you can listen there. But on every episode of Behind the Sermon, we play the audio of the sermon that happened here, and then I share all kinds of stuff about how the sermon was written, how it came about, what I thought about it, what I felt about it, what I think I screwed up on and wish I could have to do over again, just all sorts of stuff. So it's kind of fun. So if you miss one in the sermon series, you can go back and listen to it on that. This one will be there. I reminded the folks over at Relevant this morning that they could listen if they were attending Kids Church. So, but today I want to talk about one of our emotional responses to loss. Of course, there's all sorts of different emotional responses. Maybe the one we think of the most is sadness. We lose something, we're sad, right? But another really common emotional response is anger. About a year ago, my wife and I received a whole bunch of packages we receive packages from Amazon all the time, but at Christmas time a year ago, for some reason, all of our extended family and relatives and grandparents and stuff decided that they would send every single Christmas gift via Amazon to our house. And because Amazon is the way that Amazon is, they packaged each gift individually in a box, in boxes that were much too large for the item that was in the box. And so we just had mountains of boxes every single day showing up at our door. We'd have this big old box, and there'd be a deck of cards inside it or something. And so just every day. And over the course of these packages arriving in December, there was one that came, or that was supposed to have come, that didn't come. And the family member called and said, "Hey, did you get this gift?" We said, "No, we didn't get that." So then we went on Amazon, and Amazon said, "Oh, it was delivered on this day at such and such a time." And so we thought, "Man, that's weird." And so we looked at, and eventually we finally landed on the explanation that someone had taken the package off of our porch, and we were angry about it. It was a loss. And we were angry about it. And of course, we didn't get charged for the thing. We told Amazon about it, and in the end, they sent us a replacement item. And then, horror of horrors, when we were packing up our house, you guys know where I'm going with this. When we were packing up our house to move here to Redlands, lo and behold, we found an Amazon package that was unwrapped and unopened, and the inside was the item that we had marked as stolen and were angry about. Someone stealing, so we ended up, we called Amazon and we sent it back, and we kind of felt silly. But I just want to ask for a vote, a raise of hands. Raise your hands with me. Would you raise your hand if you've had an item stolen off of your front porch before, your back porch? Is there any? Raise them high. And there's a few of us here. All right. I bet there's 15 people that have raised their hands. Wouldn't you? Now, everyone put your hands out now. Of those of you who have had some, or maybe if you haven't, would you raise your hand if you have put some sort of security prevention system in place? Like, do you have a video camera, or do you have a secure box? Or raise your hand if you put something in place to prevent such an occurrence. Some of us, yes, you guys know about this thing. Well, because you're all, this is a thing, right? We know about people stealing packages. I want you to watch this video and just kind of see what comes up for you. And some of you who've had packages taken, you may have more feelings come up than others, and that's okay. So if this is a safe place for those, but I just want you to watch this video and just see kind of what your reaction is to it. There's no audio, so don't worry about that. There's just this, blank. Amazon guy takes a picture. Some of us had those where they take the picture of the box being delivered, and then can you believe that? Do you guys need to see that again? You saw it? All right, so here's the question to you. How do you feel about this situation? The guy puts the delivery down. He takes a picture of it to prove that he delivered it, and then he steals it. How does that make you feel? Angry, right. It's a loss, and the correct, understandable, common, normal reaction to that, it's predictable, we should expect, is anger. No. That's not how it's supposed to be. And it completely makes sense in the face of, and I make that pronouncement boldly. It makes sense. When we have this anger that comes up in the face of loss, we have all kinds of questions. Why would they do such a thing? Why would that happen? Our anger leads us to resist the injustice of that situation. It maybe even pushes back. Maybe we even, after we see that video on our house, we put in that, metal lockbox thing that they have to put it in, that they can't steal it after they've delivered it. We want the problem to be solved. We want justice to happen. So, anger and outrage, I think, is so common in grief that every single model that we looked at last week, I mentioned Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, maybe the original model of grief recovery, but there are many, many, many others. And essentially, every single model of grief recovery that I've looked at has some sort of, they tip their hat to, we would expect that at some place along the line, we might go through a phase where anger or frustration is something that comes out in the process of going through grief. Each and every one of them predict that as being a part of it. And so we could say, according to most experts, these reactions of anger, they're guttural, they're automatic, they're oftentimes illogical. It doesn't necessarily make sense. The things that we want or demand out of that are unreasonable. It's inside of us, and it comes out. It's the normal response as a part of our grief and recovery. Now, some of us in this room may be uneasy with this bold pronouncement that it's normal to respond to loss with anger. Some of us may be uneasy with that. Some of us may disagree with that, and that's okay. Many of us in this room, we've been taught for a lifetime. Just over in Relevant, we did a little quiz about family culture and family system and how different emotions are sometimes not okay in certain family cultures and family systems. We're not going to do that here. But many of us here in this room, we've been taught for a lifetime to beware of our anger, to be skeptical of it, to pay attention to it. Recently I read, I made a commitment to myself a couple years ago that I wanted to read a bunch of classic literature that I had never read before. I wanted to go back. I didn't feel like I had kind of an awareness of. So I started reading all sorts of classic literature. I read Moby Dick. I did not know, by the way, you could write an entire chapter of a book about how to spool rope. That book it's long for a reason, and it's not because the story is long. Anyway, but one of the books I read, and my challenge to myself to read a lot of classic literature, was Alexander Dumas' The Count of Monte Cristo. Some of you, have you ever read that? Alexander, it's just old, but classic book. A remarkable story about a man who was wrongly imprisoned, arrested on his wedding night, sent to an island prison, and then escapes and was befriended and then becomes really wealthy, and then he has these multiple personalities, but it all is driving toward where he will exact revenge on the people who put him in prison and took his life away from him. It was just, I was blown away by it. I really, really enjoyed the read. But, many of us have been taught for a lifetime to beware of our anger, because you might turn out like Edmund, what's his name? I'm blanking on the character's name. Huh? Edmond, yes. So we've been taught for a lifetime to be aware of our anger, that we don't turn out or turn into someone whose life is consumed with revenge, with getting back, with fighting back, with pushing back. We've warned, man, our anger can lead us into directions that are not really okay. And of course, literature and film as a whole are filled with these cautionary tales about anger run amok. In a way, the revenge film is a genre to itself. From Star Trek to Star Wars to Game of Thrones to The Princess Bride to essentially any Quentin Tarantino film, The Revenant, The Punisher. We could go on and on and on, right? Revenge is a theme. We know what happens. I've actually preached a sermon about forgiveness once, and I quoted and talked about this one film. There's a film called The Interpreter, and I'm not going to tell you all about it now, but one of the greatest lines from the film, they're talking, there's this woman who's the main character, the interpreter, she's having a dialogue with this man who's struggling with anger over some loss that he had been in, and he really wants to get revenge, and she draws out this metaphor for him, and she says this line, it's the line of the movie: vengeance is a lazy form of grief. In a way, she says, vengeance is kind of a short-circuited form of grief. And so for those of us who are Christians, we're skeptical of that anger reaction. We kind of know where it leads, and especially maybe as Christians, we might be doubly skeptical ourselves. We've been taught our whole lives that our anger could lead to sin, and we think about what Jesus says, turn the other cheek. Don't be angry with your brother. We think about Paul. Rid yourself of all anger, he says in Ephesians. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. We read James. Be slow to speak. Be slow to anger, we read in the book of James. And so all of this, like the cultural warnings and the films and Alexander Dumas and Jesus and Paul, all of this, it might lead us to think that feeling or expressing anger in loss is not permissible, or it's not wise. We shouldn't do it at all. And yet, our very scriptures are full over and over and over again with descriptions of people who wear their emotions boldly on their sleeves and unapologetically complain out. And many times, their anger is directed at God himself. The scripture, the Bible that we have is full of these. Psalm chapter 13 reads, "How long, O Lord, will you forget your people? Will you forget me? How long will you hide your face from me? How long do I have to wrestle through my thoughts every day, have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me, God? Look at me and answer," the writer says. "Give light to my eyes, or I will die. My enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will reject." In chapter 3 of his book, Job complains to God, "Why is life given to those in the first place if they have no future?" Why is God given life in the first place to people who are only surrounded by difficulties? "I can't eat for sighing. My groans pour out with water. What I always feared has happened to me." You imagine praying that to God? "God, the very thing that I feared the most in life, you have done it to me. Thanks a lot. What I have dreaded has come true. I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest. Only trouble comes." Even in the New Testament, we hear anger in response to loss. Think about Martha, who in response to the loss of her brother blusters to Jesus, "If you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died." Mercy. This past week, I worked through some of a new book that came out in December, a book by Matthew Cortman called Saying No to God. And in the book, he writes about this idea of pushing back against God. And one of the most poignant pieces, I thought, was his description of Jacob. He discusses Jacob as someone who pushes back against God. In fact, he talks about Jacob's name, who is changed to Israel, and the name Israel itself means one who wrestles with God and who overcomes. And kind of the thesis of this book is that not only Jacob, but Israel as a people are a people who withstand God, in his words, and stand their ground. Israel are a people who presses back against God, who argues with, who express their anger. In the book, he quotes the theologian Peter Rollins, something paradoxical about this faith, that absolute commitment to God involves a deep and sustained wrestling with God. In the story of Jacob, we discover that the Israelites are to be marked out not as a people who live out their faith through unquestioning submission, but as a people who demonstrate their love and commitment to the source of their faith and a radical commitment to fighting with that source. This is a people to be marked out by struggling, by passion, by critical engagement. The name Israel is not some kind of curse or dispassionate description. It is a blessing. The book goes on to talk about Abraham arguing with God. Could there be, thinking about Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham arguing with God. What if there was only 10? What if there was 5? What would you, God, are you sure you're going to do that? Just people who are characterized by pressing back against God. In our text for this week, Lamentations chapter 2, I think we can hear anger seeping through the words of the poet. If you weren't with us last week, we kind of previewed Lamentations. It's this book that was written to reflect sadness and grief over Jerusalem and the temple that was lost. It's read every single year aloud at the holiday of the destruction, at the remembrance of the destruction of the temple, both temples. And it's filled with this pain and agony of a people who have been exiled from their place of worship and from this land that God had promised them. And we hear anger in the voice. I'm going to read from chapter 2, verse 20. Look, Lord, and consider. Who have you ever treated like this? Should women eat their offspring, the children they have cared for? Can you imagine? Should priest and prophet be killed in the sanctuary of the Lord? Young and old lie together in the dust of the streets. My young men and my young women have fallen by the sword. You have slain them in the day of your anger. You have slaughtered them without pity. As you summon to a feast day, so you summon me terrors on every side. In the day of the Lord's anger, no one escaped or survived. Those I cared for and reared, my enemy has destroyed. The author goes on to say in chapter 3, so I say, all my splendor is gone, and all I had hoped for from the Lord. Some of us have prayed that prayer to God. And some of us, I don't know if we would even feel comfortable praying that prayer to God. God, you have taken all that I have hoped for. God, who have you ever treated like this? God, how can you do this to me? It's anger directed at God. So here's where I'm going with all this. While I think that we're right to be suspicious of vengeance, of seeking revenge, of kind of that simmering, stewing anger that can lead to all sorts of behaviors that maybe aren't the best, I think we're right to be suspicious of that. I also think that if in our process of grief and loss, it leads us to a place of anger and frustration, even if it leads us to a place where we press back upon God and what it feels like his plan is and that it doesn't make sense, if it leads us to that place where we might be filled with outrage or questions or maybe even demands, if we get to that place, I think we are in good company. We're not only where the mental health experts predict we will be, but we're following in the footsteps of the people who walked with God, for the people who put the scriptures together in the first place. You know, I mentioned this last week. Grief is hard work. It's not easy. It's not always fun. And it's possible to sidestep it. You know, there's many different ways we can sidestep it and get around it. We could sidestep it by not being willing to admit it, a la our work last week. We can sidestep it in all sorts of ways. Sometimes people sidestep it in crusades. They sidestep it in a crusade to get revenge, and they avoid going through the grief they need to go through by hiding it in that anger. Some of us sidestep it by medicating it with substances or entertainment or success. Some of us deny that it's there altogether. Some of us, we got to be too macho or we got to be too proud or whatever. But if we want to heal, we want to get through loss as better people, if we want to recover, we have to do the work. You know, this week I was reminded of the good company that we are all in as we go through grief. When I attended Grief Share, our church hosts a group of people who get together to talk about loss once a week, and it's just kind of at the end of a cycle. They're going to begin a new cycle again in the next couple of months. But I attended that group and just sat and had conversation with folks who have lost in unspeakable ways. And I found it an enriching and wonderful and beautiful experience to sit around with folks who are filled sometimes, and in some cases, with a profound anger and many questions. And we asked all sorts of questions of God. Does God even care about this? Can we even influence him? When I pray, does he hear? Does he even care? Do my prayers even matter at all? Why did God do this? Why pray in the first place? Is God trustworthy? How can I possibly trust God when this happened? And it's another subject entirely. We'll probably go into this on the podcast, but I think entirely too many things are attributed to God. We sort of assume that everything that happens, it happens because God did it. And I kind of think that's a trap, but we're not going to go there this morning. That's a rabbit trail. But I think we're in good company if we find ourselves in places of frustration in our loss. And so where does that leave us here this morning? As we kind of near the close of the sermon today, I want to share a story. It's a bit of a current event, but I think it gives us a little bit of a roadmap for what it might look like to see some of this unfold in our lives. I'm a basketball fan, and in specifics, I'm a Los Angeles Lakers fan. I need to get down to a game. I've not made it yet to a game, but I'm a Lakers fan, and we're having a good year, us Lakers fans. It's going well. But I heard this week, I have a story that's not related to the Lakers, but I heard this week there's a player who became, he has like the longest running career of any player. Right? Does anybody know who this is? Happened this week. Anybody at all? No? Justin? Huh? Carter. Yes, Vince Carter. Vince Carter began his NBA career in 1999. Vince Carter this week became the first person ever to play in 4 different decades as a National Basketball Association player. He's 42, I think, or 43. I don't know if he can still dunk. The picture on the left is him as like an 18-year-old. The picture on the right is him just this week, 42 years old. He's played in 4 different decades. Started in the 90s, then he played in the 2000s, the aughts. I'm really excited about being able to say that I lived in the aughts, in aught 5. I got married in aught 5. It's really great. He played in the aughts, he played in the 10s, and now he's played in the 20s after this year. Really remarkable story. This guy, he was one of the best players in the league. He won Rookie of the Year as a rookie, right? So the best player who is a rookie. He averaged over 20 points, which is a lot, for 10 seasons in his NBA career. The highest point average he averaged over the course of his career was 27 points one year. He was an MVP candidate. He's one of the best players in the league at his prime. And at the same time, Vince Carter, this guy has had 5 seasons where he's averaged under 10 points. Can you imagine that? He went from being one of the very, very best at the top of the game, the top of the world, to now he's sort of like a role player side guy. This year he hardly even gets to play. He's almost like a player coach. They have him on the team. I think he's playing in Atlanta this year. They have him on the team sort of to kind of help all these young fellers, along the way. And he hardly scores. I think he's averaging 5 points a game this year. Now let me tell you something about Vince Carter. There is no possible way he could have done this. He could have had the career that he has, and he's not retired yet. There's no possible way he could have had the career that he has without having gone through great change, right? He has gone through, just in the course of his career, he's gone through all sorts of losses. And he would not be able to have, if he had resisted these changes, if he had resisted those losses, there's no way he could have set this record. There's no way he would have still been. In fact, there are many, many players who were of his caliber. You know, Kobe Bryant, one of my favorite players, is one of them. Carmelo Anthony, we could go down a list of players who were in his same generation, who were of his same caliber, who were not willing to go through the loss of change, and so just retired. You know, things in life change. We go through all sorts of loss. And we can fight it, and it's normal to feel angry about it. And sometimes that anger can lead to constructive things, but we go through loss over the course of our whole lives. And I think it's possible to accept it and to grieve it and to process it and to apply old wisdom. You know, sometimes I wonder, how much additional suffering do we go through because we're gripping too tightly how things used to be, and we're not willing to go through the process of grief? You know, it's super easy to say it up here. It's super easy to make that pronouncement on everybody else. I don't do it flippantly. It's hard. It's really hard, and it doesn't happen by just making a decision. And so here is the invitation for us today. And it's a challenge. Here's the invitation. The invitation is to consider that the path of grief may include moving from a place of protest and resistance to a place of acceptance. That doesn't mean we have to be in one place or another, but it may be that the path of grief leads us from a place of protest, maybe eventually to a place of acceptance. And maybe somewhere down the road it may lead us to a place of strange gratitude. And like I said, I don't think it's a simple choice. I don't think it's a decision, and there's all sorts of work along the way that we can do that I think helps get us there. And some of those things show up like a gift. For some of us, some of our work to do in loss may be surrounded by forgiveness. Maybe forgiving ourselves, maybe forgiving the one who hurt us. For some of us, it may involve accepting responsibility for the loss or doing restitution. For some of us, it may be about information gathering and just getting more facts about what happened, understanding exactly why it was that we lost what we lost. You know, for some of us, it may be about context. You know, it may be the long game. It may be that some of our work is about thinking about the life, our own life, and the loss in terms of the biggest possible picture. And that's where I want us to close this morning. And we're gonna sing in just a moment a song that sort of leans into us thinking about that broader context. We're gonna sing the song 626 in a little while. And whenever I sing this song, I think of my grandfather. It's a picture of my grandfather I don't know even when this was. It's probably in the 50s. I'm not sure, maybe even in the 40s. But this was out in Washington, D.C. He was a dean and a chaplain at Columbia Union College out in Washington, D.C. And whenever I sing this song, I think of my grandfather and his singing group, the Messengers. They had a great rendition of this song. In a little while, we are going home. And if you listen to the collection of songs that my grandfather's group had, they all, every single one of them, almost to a T, leaned us forward and pointed us to this broader context, that yes, we go through loss, and yes, it is consequential, and yes, we have big emotions and big reactions to it, and yes, we believe in a God who's taking us somewhere, who's leading the story. We believe in a God who's trustworthy and who ultimately will put the wrongs right. The reality we see in this moment will not be the reality that we live in forever. So I want to invite you to sing with us as we're going to sing this song. And I want to invite you to stand up and sing in a little while. I took your intro.
Let us sing a song that will cheer us by a way. In a little while we're going home, for the night will end in the everlasting day. In a little while we're going home. In a little while we shall cross the billows' foam. We shall meet at last when the stormy winds are past. In a little while we're going home. We will do the work that our hands may find to do. In a little while we're going home. And the grace of God will our daily strength renew. In a little while we're going home. In a little while we shall cross the billows' foam. We shall meet at last when the stormy winds are past. In a little while we're going home. We will smooth the path for some weary, way-worn feet. In a little while we're going home. And may loving hearts spread around an influence sweet. In a little while we're going home. In a little while across the billows foam. We shall meet at last when the stormy winds are past. In a little while we're going home. There's a rest beyond, there's relief from every care. In a little while we're going home. And no tears shall fall in that city bright and fair. In a little while we're going home. In a little while we shall cross the billows foam. We shall meet at last where the stormy winds are past. In a little while we're going home.
Let's pray together. Our God, we, as human beings, we lose. We lose people we love. And we lose jobs and opportunities and influence. And we make mistakes. We lose friends, and it's unnamed, the number of things that we suffer through. And it's easy to blame. And it's easy to go on crusades, and it's easy to blame ourselves and to be angry with you. And we must do it. We do that as we heal. And dear Jesus, I pray as we express our frustration and as we let it light us on fire in pursuit of making this world a better place, I pray that we might know deep in our hearts the bigger picture. We may embrace the beauty of the story that you're telling us that all things will be made right in the end. And that the aim of our anger, the aim of our frustration is also a promise. I pray that you are with us as we suffer and as we support one another and hold one another up. Bless us and lead us away with hope and courage, we pray in your name. Amen. Please be seated.